Like this show and want to make your own? Let me tell you about Anchor. It's free, and they have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And now you can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Hi, and welcome to the Vocal Fries Podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Megan Figueroa.
And I'm Carrie Gillen.
Hi, Carrie.
Hi, Megan. Welcome back.
I know, I'm very tired. I was just in Miami to watch the first presidential debate.
How was it, actually? Like, being in the room, I mean, because I watched that whole debate, but It's different when you're watching it on TV.
Oh, it was amazing. Especially since it's like, you see all the behind the scenes things where they're like trying to make everything like go well. Cause there was a mic situation, right? Where there was like a hot mic and they try to like laugh it off, but it's like, wow, these people, they take it very seriously.
Of course, as they should.
Right. But, so being in the room was really interesting because you got to hear like all the people sighing or like not getting, jiving with the people, the candidates, or like really jiving with the people. So it was unreal, but I didn't expect it to be so linguistically relevant.
Yes. I mean, okay. I guess I could have predicted that there would be some Spanish spoken, just given the fact that it's in Miami.
Yes.
That it was a
Telemundo, which actually we sat next to like the Telemundo, like a lot of people from Telemundo, and they were so happy every time he spoke. And it was like kind of telling because it's like, wow, we do not allow these people in these spaces as often as we should.
Yes. Right.
So yeah, there's that. And also kind of side note, wow, Miami, Spanish is everywhere. And, I know that like Tucson has a huge Latinx population, but oh my gosh, like the Spanish is not as prevalent.
No.
As it is in Miami.
Yeah, I've never been to Miami, but that was definitely my impression of it. And I remember in Dexter, there was even some mocking of people who didn't speak any Spanish at all.
Yeah.
Because it's like, how did you grow up in Miami and not learn any Spanish? So I thought that was kind of an interesting peek into what it must be like to live there.
Yeah, no, like, so interacting with anyone like at a coffee shop or something, like, there's just kind of like, they use Spanish and like, you can use it back, or like, there's this assumption that like, at least there's a good chance that whoever you're talking to might speak Spanish, so,
yeah.
And everyone was so kind. I don't know if that's gets set it up. But I loved that experience. I hated the weather. But anyway, back to Spanish.
Fair enough.
I don't know how anyone speaks anything and they're not just like melting on the floor at all times. And again, I was sitting next to Telemundo, so like they weren't like impressed at all about like Beto coming right out the gate and talking Spanish. And I know that he grew up in El Paso and like around the community, but there was something immediately gross and icky. Like he wasn't addressed in Spanish.
Yeah. So if he'd been addressed in Spanish first, like what happened the next night, with Buttigieg,
right,
it would have felt more natural.
Right, yes. So Buttigieg, I had no icky feelings about that. For some reason, it just, Beto really felt more gross and icky than Cory Booker even. But Cory wasn't addressed in Spanish either. I don't know what it is about, maybe because Cory gave the greatest side eye to Beto when he was talking in Spanish, that I was like, well...
then I was like, later I was like, because at the time, yeah, it was amazing. But later I was like, well, maybe he was just mad that he didn't get to do it first.
Oh, yeah. I don't know who tweeted it, but they're like, when someone brings up the point that you wanted to bring up before you got the chance kind of thing. So, yeah, it's a good possibility that's what it was.
I mean, I don't know. It kind of came up in my mind.
Neither one of them, I haven't heard them address it.
No, me either.
Spanish
but
use.
I haven't looked for it either, so I don't want to be like, oh, they didn't address it.
Right.
I don't know.
But then, so again, like in the room, no one cares that these two men are speaking Spanish. So then when Julian Castro used it at the end, there was just cheering in the room because, I mean, I think it's almost fair to say that not everyone in the room knew who he was before.
Definitely.
But there was still authenticity to his use of Spanish that was really like poignant in the room. And I think a lot of people thought so too. That's what I was reading on Twitter is like, no hate. Well, except I saw some hate. People were saying his Spanish was basic. And I'm like, oh my God. I can't even engage with this right now. Like, this is so exhausting. So. I
mean, I did understand him, but, like, is that a bad thing?
Right. I mean, again, I think we've talked so much on this podcast about, like, why would we even begin to complain about language that we can understand when, it's about communicating with your interlocutors or, who you're speaking with. And that's why it's so terrible when people like correct grammar, when what that person said. There was no miscommunication. You're just being an asshole.
Right. And that reminds me of something that I posted on the Fries a couple days ago, or maybe yesterday, about like I was sat versus I was sitting and how people were just totally shitting on the I was sat construction, which is very normal in the UK.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw that. I know. And I mean, like, I think I've mentioned before that, like, my mom's past tense of sit is set. It's just like, like, there's just so many ways that people, I mean, it's frustrating. There's not only one way to say anything ever. And that's one of, like, the things that makes human language and amazing.
Right. What I find interesting about it is it kind of like, because you're using different, what linguists call aspect, but like, it's just a different form of the verb in each case. So, like the "I was sat," it's more like you're focusing on the total event. Like there was you sat down and then you were sitting there for a long time. Like, but you were sat. Versus I was sitting. Like you're like in the middle of the sitting. Do you know what I mean? So I found that like a really fascinating, interesting difference, and both are obviously acceptable, and people should get over themselves.
Yeah, but it's just like, I don't know. We should be celebrating how amazing these things are instead of
insisting on one way to talk that's false. And how boring is that? Why do you want everybody to talk the same way?
And how obvious does it make that that's not about language ultimately?
Right.
You know?
You're right. It's absolutely not about that. But the interesting thing about I was sat in the UK is very standard now. So like it was regional and it's spread. And people are still shitting on it because in their head, they're still associating it with a certain region.
Yeah. So one more thing from the Spanish situation. I did get to meet Julian after, and he, so once I mentioned, I was like, as far as I'm concerned, you're the only Texan on stage at a, little jab at Beto. But then it brought up him talking about how if I noticed, he didn't feel the need to speak Spanish until the very end. And so, like, this is something that he was thinking about, too. And it's going back to, like, the authenticity thing or poignancy is that he grew up in a bilingual, bicultural home. And, I was listening to an interview with him, a past interview, and it was with Maria Hinojosa of Latino USA, and she basically says, what do you say to people when they say you don't speak Spanish? And he's like, whoa, Maria, it's not 0 to 100 here,
Right.
And he was saying that, like, I may not be fluent in it, but I do speak some and I understand it. And it's like one of those things that I struggle with too, where I'm like, oh, I don't want to give myself any credit for the Spanish that I do know. It's just because there's just like so many like deeply foundational values that I learn because of like assimilation that's expected on like Latinos and all of this. So it's something that's like, I think a lot of Mexican Americans will feel very connected to that whole, oh, wait, it's not 0 to 100. It's, you know, and I hope we embrace that more than saying I don't speak Spanish or I do speak Spanish. Like, it's not 0 to 100.
And that's true for any language.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I know it's really complicated when it's your community language and, you know, you're not fluent, but you have enough language to like speak some, like
right.
It's, you know, it's a complicated identity thing. And
yeah. And for someone like Maria who you know, is Mexican, and for her to be like, what do you say to those people who say you don't speak Spanish? She was also accusing him of not speaking Spanish with that question. And it was like, I'm glad he stood up for himself, basically, is the moral of that story. Yeah.
And spoke up for all people who speak language to a different degree than some other people. Yeah. I don't even know how to like say it.
I know, because you know what? It's going to be some people within your own community that are going to be the meanest.
Yeah, that's really the problem. There's a lot of policing, like we've talked about before, internally to the community.
It's toxic. It's been toxic. But I think linguists are trying, or, you know, and like educational linguists and anthropologists and all these people are trying really hard to get out there and get their message out saying, don't be an asshole.
Right.
About this spectrum of bilingual or multilingualism. Well, anyway, that was a great experience. I am exhausted still. I am a very delicate flower. A
delicate flower that got transported all the way to Miami and back. So that's pretty cool.
My body doesn't know what to do with 96% humidity.
Oh, I know. It's gross.
Anyway, so we have a fun episode because we talked to some of our friends.
Yes.
A couple of our friends,
good friends. Jeff and Andrew, who are both Dr. Jeff and Dr. Andrew.
Yes,
but,
Dr. Jeff and Andrew. Doctors Jeff and Andrew.
I love it. But yeah, we get to talk about what language change would be like in space, which love it.
Let me just say, I was not the nerdiest person in the room by far. I was the coolest.
Are you usually? Yes, you're definitely the coolest.
No,
are you usually
it's true.
The nerdiest person?
This is the kind of like nerdy stuff that I'm not usually partaking in, but was happy to be in the room where it happened.
Nice.
So
yeah. I mean, it was super fun. Although somehow I was the one with the most pop culture sci-fi knowledge. Yeah, which that's not normal.
Yeah.
Those two guys are way nerdier than me.
You heard it here first.
But we also have to like warn you. So unfortunately, Jeff at the very end just disappears, and he doesn't say goodbye or like anything, but he was there. He was saying those things, and his audio did not work. So
yeah. It's unfortunate because he said some really great things actually during that time. So
yeah, he did. It's too bad. But we got the majority of his conversation, so...
Yes, we did. And he wasn't being an asshole. We just had some tech issues, so...
Yeah.
And it's a very interesting conversation, even if you're not a nerd. Again, I don't usually talk about space, although I do... I mean, everyone loves space, right? Like, just the fascination of what's, like, holy shit, right?
The final frontier.
Yeah. So it's very interesting. It's very relevant to what's happening on. Obviously, we have to take from what's happening here, to kind of inform what would be happening if there was a settlement in space. So yeah. So nerd out.
Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its continuing mission: to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no one has gone before.
we have Jeffrey Punske, who is an assistant professor and the director of undergraduate studies in linguistics at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. He specializes in morphosyntax, especially in the framework of distributed morphology. He also works on linguistic pedagogy and public outreach through constructed languages, and is a graduate of University of Arizona, where I also got my degree, so that's fun.
And we also have Andrew McKenzie, who is an associate professor of linguistics and an affiliate professor in Indigenous Studies at the University of Kansas. He specializes in formal semantics and linguistic fieldwork with a focus on Native American languages, especially Kiowa. So welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
I actually, well, we know you outside of this first This is not our first meeting.
Definitely not. Years and years and years
Yes.
and years. I think it might be a decade.
Maybe, yeah.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
what, for you and Andrew?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm old, actually.
I was gonna say I wasn't
Yeah.
even born a decade ago.
You were still in your birthing pod, Megan, a decade ago.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
You were in my Native American languages class that point.
As a newborn, that was the...
As a newborn.
No,
Oh yeah, I guess about then I was constructing my own language, which is, all of you have done that as a course, right?
I don't think
Constructed languages?
I haven't, no.
You
I
haven't.
guest taught in one course that was offered on them when I was in grad school. That's as close as I've gotten, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, so since we knew you, maybe I would have done this to someone else, but we always have a document for our interviews, and I named it Nerdfest 2019.
Nice.
Which made me giggle when I saw that.
It seems fairly accurate.
Yeah. I like how out of all of your interviews, this is the Nerd Fest.
Yeah,
listen.
yeah. Well, I mean, in some ways,
mean-
it might be the nerdiest topic yet.
It truly is, in my humble opinion.
Because we're going to be talking about language in space. Why language in space? Why did you guys want to come and talk to us about that?
Why did we want to come and talk? We were invited. That's how I came. I don't know. No. But why did I not turn down the invitation?
Why did you-
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Let me turn off my semanticist brain for a moment.
No, I heard it and I was like, oh, someone's going to be offended by that.
I'm fun at faculty meetings, believe me. Now one of the things that this project kind of surprised me about is that it's a way of really getting linguistics out into the world beyond linguistics, and our field is relatively small, it's relatively new, and it often gets overlooked amongst other different social, behavioral, and cognitive sciences. And we got this note from someone at the European Space Agency who was asking, hey, do you want to, speculate on what happens if we send a vessel out for a long, long time? What happens to language on such a voyage? And it was an interesting question, and I think it's something that is worth sharing. And since the whole point was to get linguistics out, then coming on to different podcasts or other media and getting the word out kind of follows from that.
I also think a sort of natural question is why, me and Andrew would be the people to ask and answer this question. And I think, because, we have a formal semanticist and a formal syntactician trying to answer this question about long-term language change. And maybe that's a weird thing. And it is. But it also kind of stems from our work on linguistic pedagogy and linguistic outreach. So the sort of more direct connection comes from our work on gamification and gaming and linguistics, and directly from this game called Dialects, made by Thorny Games, because they actually have in this a scenario about sort of language in space and this sort of isolation and the sort of decay and loss of language in this sort of role-playing scenario. And it was the sort of gamification aspect of that sort of first tied us into the connection. And then, throughout the project, we started to do some really substantial science in a speculative way, but trying to, again, branch out into linguistics and, show off what we are as a field as well.
Is dialect available to the masses?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, absolutely.
I have
I've never heard of it.
Yeah.
What is it for your computer?
No, it's a
physical game.
It's a physical game. It's a role-playing game. It takes about 3 hours, I would say, to play through it.
Wow.
You can get it in a hardback edition, I think, and also as a PDF download. It's super fun. You don't need any linguistic background to play it. I've played it with students, not not so much in the classroom setting because it takes a little bit long to play in a physical classroom.
Yeah.
Though when I was traveling recently for a conference, I actually had some graduate students run the game over the course of a week in my invented language class, and it worked pretty well. But I've done it at gaming conventions and stuff like that with people that are just totally off the street, and it's a great way to introduce linguistics because it gives you that opportunity to talk about the importance of language and culture and language, the loss of language. I don't want to say language death, but language.
Dormancy.
What's the term? Dormancy.
Shift.
Language shift and language dormancy. Those are the terms I'm looking for. And it's just a great way to start those conversations. And Thorny Games, they actually kind of specialize in games surrounding language. So they're a great resource, and Andrew and I have also been developing some games. We presented about this at the Linguistic Society of America that are more focused on particular topics that are, really only designed to be used in a particular linguistics classroom. But so that's how we got into this world of, strangely, the European Space Agency, which is something I'd never really imagined I would be presenting at. I mean, maybe when I was a kid, I dreamed about doing something like that, but I never really thought when I was getting my PhD in linguistics, my next stop is the space agency.
Right.
But,
Right.
That's interesting. When I was still in high school, I thought I was going to go into engineering because I wanted to build spaceships.
Yeah.
Now I'm totally not doing anything related at all, but...
Well, today's the day. You're talking about space.
It's as
right.
close as I'm going to get.
It was all leading to 2019.
Exactly.
Did you
Yeah.
know that?
No,
To
definitely
this
did not.
day in May. And it's space is the great equalizer. Everyone thinks space is fucking cool.
Yeah.
It's
It
cool.
is cool.
It is cool.
Yeah, that's true. If you have to meet someone who's space, whatever.
Right.
I guess maybe some flat earthers who are space isn't real.
Yeah, okay.
But even then,
But they still think space is
even
real,
then, space
right?
is cool in its unreality, right? So,
Oh.
I mean,
So you're going to the interstellar workshop, right?
Yes.
So tell us about that. What are you going to be talking about?
So we're going to be talking about how language may change over the course of a multi-generational trip, presumably for interstellar settlements. So obviously this is something that is, to a degree, speculation. But we try to tie to a small degree speculative. We don't have the ability to forecast the future. But we try to look at some examples from past human exploration and settlements, and the ways in which language has shifted in those periods and changed. And also the sort of, failures of linguistic prediction, historical prediction, like glottal chronology and stuff like that, to just say that, we can talk about ways in which language may change, but there's no model you can apply and be like, Yes, if you put people on a ship for 200 years, language will change by 72%.
Right.
You know,
Right.
Because there is no means by which language will change. And I really think sort of fundamentally it the social and political construct of these ships is going to matter so much more to the organization of the outcome of the language that may come out of this, and so much is unknowable.
Right.
Yeah, I'm thinking I wanted to compare it to like an immigrant situation, but that's not the case because there's not going to be a language already there.
Exactly.
Well, so far as we know, right? That's
right. I wish that would be fantastic. But yeah.
So more like migration, the original migrations.
Yeah.
Yes.
Patterns.
Yes.
So one of the things we look at is the oceanic settlements. So, the settlements in the Pacific, like Polynesia. We look at, the Malagasy migration into Madagascar and so forth. And we just talk about, how we can learn lessons about, long-term settlement patterns and language change of these types. And that's one type of lesson we can talk about, but there's a lot of other types of lessons that we try to draw on in the paper and in the presentation that we're giving.
One of the key points in that is that for each of these settlements, you get different kinds of changes. And the only thing we can be certain of is that the languages and dialects at the end of the trip aren't going to be the same as they were at the beginning. And so even if there is contact in between. And so it's something that anyone who's developing one of these missions is going to have to keep in mind.
Right. So before we go too far along that track, I do want to go back to glottochronology. Can one of you explain to our listeners what that actually is?
And explain to Megan.
Okay, so in the 1950s, there were some anthropological linguists, most notably one named Morris Swadesh, who's well known for a lot of other things in linguistics, and they were trying to develop a way of essentially modeling the time that languages change across. So to see if there was a way to tell, given two languages, how far apart they diverged. And then that helps us understand their prehistory and gets into that question of people's origins that historical linguistics has always had on the back burner. And so the idea was to model it based on radioactive decay, which is a very regular process. And, with, say, carbon-14 or something, you can date things very precisely. And so if you look at, say, how phonemes change over time, could you do something similar for language change? And it turns out, no.
Yeah.
It's too complicated for that.
Yeah. As biological systems don't work that way, and they don't for other human or animal systems and so forth. So even looking at genetics, you can't really do anything that way. So, but that was the idea. So glotto for language and chronology for time, and the idea was to see if we could get anything precise and scientific about these divergences. And then and it goes into that notion that we cannot really predict conversely, if we're looking forward, we cannot predict how quickly two languages will diverge from each other. And so for a project like this, there's no way to make solid predictions. It's just physically impossible. And so we have to do very, very broad predictions of the sort of just highlighting things that have happened in the past, and with the implicature that these could happen again in the future. But we have no idea which ones will happen and which ones won't.
And we also try to comment a little bit about some of the changes that have happened sort of societally and technologically between the past and the present and presumably the future. Because, it's not like we're preparing to launch these multi-generational ships tomorrow, but there's changes in the way that we have our educational system organized. There's changes in the ways that we record language, and so forth. So all of this has an impact on the means by which language is transmitted, and language does indeed change. So all of this impacts the way in which this multi-generational ship, may, again, all of this is may, that language may shift.
Okay, let's talk about some of the factors then. You said education as one of them. Do you think that's one of the biggest ones?
Education is one of the the factors, we divided them into things that speed up divergence, like isolation and that sort of thing, and then things that slow it down. And education policy is one, right? If you make everyone speak Old Earth English, for instance, that will slow things down.
Old Earth English.
Well, the sad thing is that Earth English is going to change as well, right? So it's not even going to be the same. But education is a major one because of its, and we can see that in history. It has a major role in promoting particular dialects or languages at the expense of others. And especially when the education is universal and compulsory. And throughout history, we see, in basically every developed country that I'm aware of, at least the major ones, you see this, especially with the rise of nationalism, that the education system gets turned into a vehicle for language nationalism, essentially.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking, I'm such a big proponent of public schools, but unfortunately, they aren't really the great equalizer that we want them to be. Especially when they're kind of like the great marginalizer when it comes to communities of kids that come to school without those quote unquote standard dialects of a language.
Right. Or without that language at all. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So of course that's going to happen because you're taking the same human people are going to, take that kind of stuff with them to space.
Right. Yeah.
And some of the story, because there's a paper version of this as well, we had to make some tough choices about what to include and what not to include. But one of the examples we thought about that didn't make it into the final version, but we had toyed around with including was the examples of the boarding schools, the Native American boarding schools in the North American context. And, as both a means of education, as a means of, causing language shift. And, so we can talk about it as slowing down language change, but also as a means of speeding it up.
Oh,
and again,
definitely.
It depends on, this comes down to policy. And, so part of what Andrew and I view our role in this is we're trying to help people make informed policy about, if these multi-generational ships are to be built, it's that they should have some sort of informed policy about, what is the linguistic context of these ships and what is the linguistic policy going to be going forward.
Well, and it doesn't have to look as, I think we all agree that boarding schools are fucking terrible, but
yes,
but it doesn't have to look like that terrible from the outside because we're doing this inside public schools.
Absolutely.
We were doing this to Spanish-speaking kids way back when, and we're doing it still today in more subtle ways. So,
and it's not even to, as Andrew pointed out, it's not even to speakers of other languages. We do it to speakers of non-dominant dialects. So if you're a speaker of a variety of African American English, you're that you receive the same style of treatment in corrective treatment in the public school settings.
Right.
And more to the European aspect of it, European countries did the same kinds of, as you say, corrective measures. in their public school systems. In France, for instance, there's a very major effort to stamp out regional languages, and they would even, give students lists of things not to do with your mouth, like spitting and eating your erasers and speaking Occitan, right? And it really just built in this sense of shame and filthiness into the languages, and that social sense endured, even after those policies were officially stopped. And we see that in other European countries as well. We're seeing it now in Asian countries, and so it's it's a very widespread phenomenon. And then if you're going to put people on a vessel for a long time, is that what you want, or is this something you want to avoid, given changes in attitudes toward these policies that we've seen in the last 20, 30 years?
So I guess it's kind of like a warning, like these are going to be the type of thing, like the type of, the type of things you'll want to do with language, kind of like, yeah. And I guess you'd have to say why this happens, and it's power. So you have to talk also about power, right? And who's going to be in charge on this ship? What's that structure going to look like? The power structure going to look like?
And some of the other talks at this conference will be about those kinds of issues.
Cool.
Social constructions, ethics, and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really hoping that this will be a really productive time to talk about exactly this type of relationship, and we can really tie in the linguistics to the social power and the social construction. And yeah, I think it also is a big part is going to be just how large is the crew? How is there going to be a social stratification among the crew? Because that will certainly, and so much of this is unknowable right now, but certainly you might see this sort of breakdown among linguistically across, if you have a very clear command class versus a labor class in these ships, that could really lead to some really divisive linguistic situations as well.
Right. What if you make people wear red shirts, for instance?
I was just going to go there.
Oh, did I steal your joke?
Just gonna go there.
Wait. Is this a nerdy reference I don't get?
It is a Star Trek reference. Have you not watched Star Trek, Megan?
No.
I don't understand how you haven't seen Star Trek, but anyway, that's another issue.
Oh.
Wow, you all should see the faces they're making at me on Skype.
In the original Star Trek, everyone that wore a red shirt would die on the away missions.
Yeah.
It was like the symbol that they would be like they were the expendable extras that would die in the episode.
The main crew would wear yellow or blue, and then the red shirts were doomed.
Was that like a production before the show kind of joke to the audience kind of thing, or was that like they really were expendable, like you wanted people to know?
What do you mean by joked with the audience?
I mean, kind of like
this
how
60s.
Mary Tyler Moore like pulled her ear like
no this no, this is the 60s. It's not.
Yeah, it was just poor planning.
Okay.
Or not poor planning. It was just, I don't know.
That's what I mean. Was it planned by the...
I think it was sort of an act, like it became a plan over time. I might be guessing. I mean, I'm guessing, but so like the command people, you don't want them to die, and you don't want your scientists to die, but the engineering types, it's all right if they die.
Oh my gosh, engineering sounds important on a ship.
Well, of course it is, but
not as important as language policy, though.
Not as important as the communication specialist.
Exactly. No, the red shirts were. And you kind of see it on other Star Trek series where they don't have that quite a blatant division, but just as part of the storytelling, we're focused on the high command and the people who run the ship, and so all the hoi polloi who are who get blown up when the ship gets hit. We never really see anything about them.
Yeah. So the point I was going to make is that you don't really see a linguistic distinction in Star Trek, but you might expect it if it were more realistic.
Yeah.
So speaking of sci-fi and more realistic, so have you guys seen The Expanse?
No.
I have not. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, so there's a Creole that they don't fully use on the show. Like they use the light version. So they have a linguist who created 3 versions of this Creole. One that's like, full Creole, one that's sort of medium, and then the light version. And the light version is basically very accented English with like a few things that are not super English grammar. Anyway, it's a really fascinating show for a variety of reasons, but you should just check it out for the linguistic reason, at least.
Okay.
Excellent.
What, I was going to say channel, but what, yeah.
Service.
Yeah, whatever people say.
How does one come about to this?
Yeah.
So you can watch it on Netflix, it looks like.
Okay.
Oh.
I have.
So we've watched it on DVDs, and then I don't remember where we watched it. But anyway, yes, I recommend it. And it's like it's because it's a linguist, it really does have like, seems more coherent than just a random choice. Like they
like Firefly.
He looked to Haitian Creole for inspiration about how to create it.
Yeah.
But it's more interesting to talk about if you actually know it. So.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about, okay, so if there is going to be this like social stratification and like there's going to be people that are actually driving the ship or whatever you do steer it? I don't know. I've not seen Star Trek apparently. But like, so are they going to be, they're going to be more important? Okay. So just imagine that they've decided that some people are more important than others. And there's this like labor class. What happens between a labor force and then like, whatever, the scientists and stuff? They are going to possibly have some language change that is slowed down, maybe.
I think what we would see in that context is the sort of Lebovian style social construction through language change. So, like, if you look at the Martha's Vineyard study, where you're going to find an example of a certain linguistic feature that is a marker of a certain type of social identity becoming more and more pronounced as a means of social identification. And this is even possible, I think, if there is like a strong identification with ship identity and there is two-way maintenance of two-way communication somehow with the home planet, but like the those on the ship develop like a really strong ship-based identity, that you may find that this sort of like the types of features that Lebov identified, where you get like certain linguistic features just become more and more pronounced as a means of encoding this social identity.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And you would see that inside the ship as well. If there was a division to be made, it wouldn't be driven by the isolation, but more of the social the deliberate social isolation.
Yes, that's the deliberate social isolation. Okay, cool. I mean, must there be social stratification if we are?
No. Right. Again, this is all of this may happen.
Right.
Yeah. And so and it might depend on the crew and then this gets into the ethics and the kind of crew you select for and the kind of education system you put onto the ship and that sort of thing. Yeah.
The kind of structure that you establish within the ship, and I think these are all things that, this is why I think they're wanting to organize this conference now, and start these conversations now, is that if you can, again, we're not close to having, I don't know how far we are, but it's not like we're about to build and launch the ship tomorrow. But by having these conversations early, they can start thinking about the actual structures and, ideal sizes and types of things that are really necessary to do this type of mission. Mission success, I think, really is going to need more than just like, we need X type of technology. It really has to think about the humanist and behaviorist and social sides of things for these things to be successful.
So is there an ideal size to send into space like this?
That is a great question. I have no idea.
I don't either.
Yeah, me either.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. It's hard to tell. I mean, historical examples aren't always useful because they're, they might involve between 50 and a few hundred people, but then going into the past, into colonial eras, we also had different kinds of social stratification already in place. And so it's kind of hard to compare. Yeah. And I'm sure the engineers and food specialists would end up having more determining, say on the size of the crew. But for linguistic purposes, yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, oftentimes a smaller community can isolate itself more easily, and then that might lead to quicker language change. But and then you might get this kind of founder effect if other ships arrive after them. You get this sort of Mayflower family stratification. And so, another question is, how many crews do you send? Do you just send one? Do you send two at a time? Do you send, one after another? And each of these will have different effects on various issues, but including language development. If you have two different crews who can communicate with each other as they hurtle through space, then that will decrease their isolation, each crew's isolation.
Are we assuming one language?
That's
we're not.
We're not. The paper largely focuses on, what happens for English, but that's mainly just for expository convenience. It's just, we're writing in English. Everyone everyone reading this paper can read English. So we talk about English, but this would apply no matter which language we involve. And then if we involve multiple languages, then it gets...
And different modes?
Yeah, we point out, actually, that one of the things that we can actually be certain about is that over time there will be congenitally non-hearing passengers on board. And, so if it will probably be incumbent on any crew or any mission of this sort to involve at least a signed language alongside any spoken language. And so in that case, there will always at least be some multilingualism. So the question of how many languages actually get sent onto this vessel, that's always going to be a thorny one. In a modern era where a lot of educated people are multilingual anyways, it might not be such a thorny issue. But then there's that question of, do you pick a lingua franca, a common language that everyone can use even when they're not using their native language, which would probably be English, just given the state of things. But which might not be, right? It depends on the crew as well. And we see this for the space station now, where for parts of the mission, everyone speaks Russian when they're getting up to the space station. And then in the space station, they tend to use English. And it turns out that there have been issues of miscommunication that result from this, but because there's not a clear policy. It's just it just kind of emerged this way where, okay, well, while we're in Russia, let's use the Russian. We have all the machines are in Russian. Everything. We'll just use Russian. And then, but there's not an official policy. And then, so one of the proposals that we make is that whatever this mission ends up being, that the planners need to set out a language policy, and they need to equip the crew with enough linguistic awareness to maintain this policy or to adapt when things don't fall according to plan.
Well, I gotta say, as a linguist, I never thought about any of this and how it would be complicated. But of course it is.
And just to build off of what Andrew said a little bit, I mean, there's also been sort of related to this, a push for, obviously having genetic diversity in any sort of crew. And this is in some related previous work. And one of the appeals we make in just the conclusion is that if that is something that is important, we said that it may also be incumbent upon us to also attempt to have linguistic diversity for the maintenance of our sort of shared cultural and history, and that that we shouldn't necessarily just even if we do have a lingua franca, that we shouldn't just say the language will be French, the language will be Russian, the language will be English or whatever, and that but we should also at least attempt to have some version of linguistic diversity as a component of the crew selection,
which will be determined partially by how many crew you're allowed to have.
It would be,
right?
Yeah, I mean, and of course, if you're only going to say, we're going to have linguistic diversity and we're going to send one Navajo speaker in this crew, well, that's going to be pointless long term for a multi-generational ship. So
you need 3 at least.
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't see why we should privilege Navajo over Kiowa.
I agree.
I mean, fair enough, Andrew.
Team Kiowa.
There you go. Yeah.
Let's go back a little bit to comparing what happened in the past. So what does the Polynesian case tell us about what might happen in space?
So what we look at with the Polynesian case is largely the fact that we see the movement of the Polynesian people to sort of diverse Pacific islands, which are spread out from each other, covering large geographic space, and provide over a long time span. And we see sort of this sort of slow drift of the language. What's interesting also about the Polynesian case is there's sort of this sort of cultural idea to a lot of people that sort of are aware of the Polynesian case that the Polynesian was sort of settled by a fleet of ships that went out and never came back. But there's considerable evidence that Polynesian involved sort of some form of repeated contact. And so what we can see from that is sort of we have this idea of the movement of, this group of humans coming from Earth to, I don't know, Alpha Centauri. And but
I don't get it.
that is the closest planetary system to us, Megan.
Oh, okay.
Well, I don't know if are there planets on Alpha Centauri or near? I mean, it's the nearest star to Earth, or to the sun, I should say. The sun is the nearest star to Earth, but the nearest star after that is Alpha Centauri.
Yeah, and so I have no idea if there are planets there.
If there are planets, it's only 4 light years away. So, hopefully there's something there we could send a mission to. It would take many hundreds of years, but that's our neighbor. But
I just picked it because it's close. Yeah, it's got a great name.
And I just pretended like I didn't know what you were talking about, just in case the listeners didn't know.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
of
it's
course.
good to put yourself in there.
Very good at that, Megan.
Thank you. That's what I'm here for.
So, we talk about the types of shift that happen in Polynesian, just in a really general sense, just to talk about the the phonological, the lexical changes that can occur over these, as examples of types of language change. But then also just the fact that there is this kind of constant, or not, maybe not constant, but this continual interaction of the languages that is something that we might see given a sort of technological connection between Earth and this ship. So we there is an analogy between these two. So we might see this slow drift of the language following the same types of patterns as the ship moves away over these hundreds of years as it drifts towards hopefully not drifts, powers itself towards Alpha Centauri.
Yeah. And the Polynesian case was also informative because where the Polynesians settled, there typically were no other humans.
Yes, yeah, that's the other key thing.
Yeah, I was about to ask, what about...
And so you contrast that to the Malagasy case, where you have Austronesians, who are linguistically distant cousins of Polynesians, move to a place where there were other people, and then there's a long history of linguistic interaction and it affects the change. Malagasy adopted a number of features from Bantu that none of the related languages have, and that's something that we often see in situations where you go to a place and there are already people there.
So even in Malagasy's case, there wasn't necessarily that there were, it's sort of disputed whether or not there were people on Madagascar. It's really not critical for us. It doesn't matter. But they were close enough to the Bantu speakers, whether or not they were in Southern Africa or in Madagascar, which they probably weren't, but who cares? They were close enough to interact, which is very different than what was happening in the Pacific, where there were no people. And that's that's a great point, Andrew.
And we contrast that even to what happens in more recent immigrant situations. And so there's a good study for New Zealand English that Trudgill made that where they're within a short period of English speakers moving from different places to New Zealand, the relative isolation wasn't complete or anything. The relative isolation from other English speakers and also from any native Maori led to this formation of a dialect in not a lot of time, just a few generations. And I mean, even now today, the New Zealand dialect is still fairly distinct. And then we contrast that to a case. There's a number of cases you could pick, but the one I picked was Texas German, simply because it's my one of my heritages is Texas German, so it's partial to it. And that's a well-documented case where a lot of settlers came from different parts of Germany in the 1840s and 50s and developed communities in Texas where they spoke German almost all the time, right up until World War I, really. So we talk about other, older immigrants coming here and learning English, and they did not, and the Germans did not. They didn't have to, unless they were going to go to college or interact with state authorities or something. They might have learned English in school, but they grew up speaking German, and went to church in German, went to work in German, and so forth. And over those generations, there developed a kind of dialect of Texas German. It is distinct from other kinds of German, but it didn't quite coalesce the way that the New Zealand English did. And it seems to be in large part because these communities were surrounded essentially by English-speaking communities. So there was this interaction, and there was this pressure through the education system for this other language as well. And so, it's kind of what happens when you go somewhere and you're relatively isolated versus what happens when you go somewhere and you're not. And so if we send people to Alpha Centauri and there are no life forms there who speak a language, we might expect a dialect. If let's say there's English speakers, we might expect a new dialect to coalesce and to become quite distinct. And if there are speakers of Alpha Centauri language or something, we'll see a difference in the way that it changes.
And I guess we could learn lessons too, since this is a multi-generational, like we're trying to think multi-generational, from Earth, is that with immigrants, they speak the language from their homeland. imagine. And then they have kids, and their kids are bilingual, and then those kids have kids, and those kids have lost the language from the homeland. Then these grandchildren want to reclaim. We could possibly see that in space.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That's actually something we didn't think about, but I think that's probably true, that you would see sort of this re-identification at some point with Earth. I mean, we talk a little bit about sort of somewhat related to this idea of ritualized language coming into play, especially with if the technology, because especially as the ship moves further and further away, you're going to have presumably a sort of disconnect with Earth communications, where the time span is just going to be slower and slower. Yeah, so you might be able to still communicate, but over not in a direct means. And so the language that you use in those communications may become more ritualized in a sense, and fossilized in Old Earth English or Old Earth French or something like that. And I think, these fourth generation space dwellers may start to identify more with that ritualized language as well, and try to reclaim that.
Or the opposite.
Or the opposite, sure.
Yeah. I mean, we see that in a lot of communities that are reclaiming language. They often start with ritualistic language that ties directly into elements of culture they're also trying to reclaim, like religious speech or songs or particular formulations. Yeah, and like you said, sometimes people kind of have the opposite reaction, where they don't want anything to do with it.
Well, especially if you're in space, you might hate Earthers, right? Because we have like such a much cozier lifestyle than they do, right? I mean, that's actually another thing in The Expanse is like the Belters hate the Martians and the Earth. The Belters.
Oh, the Belters.
Like they live in the belt.
I see. Yeah, I was thinking like from Buzz Burgers. I was like, imagining them on this mission, and I'm like, that makes total sense.
We should really send the Belchers.
Would watch. But yeah, so the Belters live in the belt, and so they have like a much worse lifestyle than the people who live on Mars and the people who live on Earth, and so they kind of hate both of those groups, and those groups also hate each other. So like, there's actually a drive away from the Earth languages and more towards this Creole that they have created out of many different languages, including English. But
oh, we're going to see both of that. Like, both of those things are going to happen, I predict.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's
too bad
likely.
We probably won't see it.
I know, yeah. Yeah, where's the crazy billionaire when you need them, you know? No.
Did you see what Jeff Bezos wants to do?
I saw,
space, right? Now he wants to do something with Mars?
I think he needs to like keep a lid on the information in his own company before he starts doing these other things.
Like he just wants to put like zoos in space and like a human place in space, and like just have like all these separate things.
Space hotel.
All right.
Like kind of like that.
I missed that somehow.
Yeah.
It was like yesterday or the day before. It just came
out. Yeah.
It's really weird. It's a really weird idea.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But is there a language policy? That's the crucial question.
Maybe we should try to talk to Bezos. Hey,
I think that's really where you get the serious, whether you can tell a proposal is serious or not, is when they've started to consider these human issues.
That's true.
Right? And something that, and in sci-fi, they usually just hand wave out of it, right?
Yep.
So on Star Trek, they have universal translators. So you put it in your ear and it will instantly translate anything.
Yeah, so that's why Star Trek doesn't need a language policy, because everything just gets translated for them.
Exactly.
Right.
Although it's got to be weird. And we point out we do put a small mention in this paper that kind of technology is the polite way to say it is, we politely indicate that it's a pipe dream. And because it is. I mean,
it is.
There's no way to really language is too creative, for one thing, for that to work, and it's so complicated in the sense that a lot of the there's so much pragmatics and context and so forth. There's as much content in what we're not saying as there is in what we are saying, and so how is a machine going to translate that?
Right. Yeah, I have such huge problems with that, but that's whole nother issue.
Right. I mean, I hate to burst your listeners' bubbles.
I mean, maybe on Alpha Centauri we'll discover Douglas Adams' Babelfish.
Right. Yes.
See, that I don't know.
Oh my God.
What?
I don't know.
I'm shocked. Megan, I'm not shocked by you. I knew you wouldn't know because you're not a nerd like we are, but I'm shocked that Andrew doesn't.
Is it Hitchhiker's Guide?
It's Hitchhiker's Guide,
Douglas Adams?
See, I haven't either read that movie or read that book nor seen the movie. So, yeah.
Or the TV show.
See, I didn't know there was.
Or the radio.
The original radio play.
Wow, they're really shaming you.
That's really...
We have all these nerd cred. This nerd cred. Okay, so I guess there's probably many, many more questions I could ask, but I'll just ask one more, and then Megan, if you have others, you can too. But sort of more on the linguistic side, what vocabulary is more likely to be stable, and what vocabulary do you think is going to disappear potentially, and what's just going to change?
I think the vocabulary that is required to operate the machinery will be stable.
Yeah, the jargon definitely will.
The jargon, if only just to read the instruction manuals. And in communications with Earth, as you get further away, and it starts taking days and weeks for messages to even get back to Earth, you're not going to spend a lot of time doing any back and forth talking, and so you're just going to be sending messages. And eventually, as the people you knew on Earth stop sending messages because they're dying of old age, then it's going to come down to just technical messages. And so I think those messages will be, the content of those messages will endure. And then a lot of the basic words. So I mentioned Swadesh, Morris Swadesh earlier. One of his contributions was trying to come up with a list of vocabulary that tends not to change across languages. And the idea was that when you first encounter a language, you could ask for these vocabulary items to get a kind of sense of what sort of native words, words that weren't borrowed over time.
The Swadesh list.
And it's called the Swadesh list, right.
And that's actually what you were supposed to calculate the glottochronology against.
Exactly. It's supposed to feed the chronology. Yeah. And
coming back full circle.
And it's a linguistically problematic list because a lot of it has, say, some things that are nouns, but then in the language you ask, they're verbs, and then it goes downhill really quickly. But I find it's a good way to start, say, a field methods course. And then start introducing students to the difficulties of linguistic field methods. But typically the words are on that list because they tend not to be borrowed and they tend not to change a lot. And so I suspect that those words probably won't change that much either.
I'll post that as well.
But I think one of the key things is language change is at some level unpredictable. We can try to predict it, and we can make speculation based on the way language behaves, sort of based on history. But at the end of the day, languages do things, especially when they're changing, in unpredictable ways. But so even we find examples where, things that are not supposed to change, especially in a context situation, will undergo massive changes. So we can look at the, going back to cases of English where, the English, Old English, Old Norse borrowing situation where we get massive borrowings of pronouns. And things like that. So,
which is unusual. It's not expected.
Yeah, it's not expected. So, we don't anticipate these types of changes, but fundamentally, language change we can make sort of speculative predictions based on the way languages change, sort of in a general sense, but
anything goes almost.
Anything goes.
Yeah,
almost.
Yeah, we know change will happen. We know what kinds of changes tend to happen, but we cannot predict what will happen or how much it will happen.
What do you think then the most important thing that history has taught us
about language change?
About language. So what can we take to space that you think history is saying, this is the most important thing, you assholes? Don't not do this, or,
I would say, the motto of your podcast, don't be an asshole.
Yeah.
Yeah, right? Okay. Yeah.
It's a good life lesson.
It's a good life lesson, but it's also it's really important when it comes to language change and language policy. That is, I think when we're looking at the ways in which languages have been shaped in terms of education policy, the ways that languages is shaped in terms of language policy, give languages space to breathe, give speakers space to speak their languages. And, that's what that's what we're looking for. And when we're looking at these societies, freer societies tend to have better language outcomes, better linguistic outcomes. And I think, that's what we're going to go to this, meeting saying, when we're looking at this structure of this crew, it's really important for the linguistic outcome for there to be a free social structure within this. Obviously that you need to have a command structure for a ship, but one that has an element of freedom within it, a loose social structure.
Right. Yeah. Probably just make sure that any hierarchies that develop are practical in nature and not social in nature. Right?
Yeah.
Probably. And and that's always easier said than done.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think not being an asshole in your language policy, of course, presupposes that there is a language policy.
Yeah.
And so I think our one proposal really is more linguistics in space. The initial crew should be trained. They should have some linguistic background, and they should have, and in the education system on board, they should have linguistic education as well, and that will help them understand why these policies are helpful, and it would also help them do some linguistics, right? Because as they go on this voyage, they're part of a natural experiment, and there's going to be a lot of science going on studying what happens to the people on this vessel, and linguistics would fit right into that. And so you'll need people who can do it, so you need linguistics on board as well.
Plus, if you do come across an alien that has a language that we can somehow interpret, it'll be helpful to have linguists.
Yeah, and we didn't even get into the
of course
aliens
not.
Part
because
of the paper.
That's even more speculative.
Right.
That's actually my work with Bridget Samuels.
Mm-hmm.
I have a different set of paper. I don't know literally have no idea how I fell into this. 2.5 years ago, I was just chugging along doing some morphosyntax, and now suddenly I'm off doing a bunch of work in space.
That's awesome.
Well, then I think that's the last question I have is, why is it so important that linguists do outreach?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question.
That is a great question. I mean, I think it's important that all academics do outreach, but linguists especially. We look at the just the state of science and just education in the world, and especially in the US right now, and we are in not a very good place in terms of scientific literacy, educational literacy, and we as academics, we do a very bad job transmitting our fields to the popular world. We just flat out. And the expectation seems to be, well, the people don't understand us, so that's their fault, not ours. And that is a bullshit response.
Yes, it is.
Because it's not the people's fault. It is our fault. And one of the reasons is that we don't really try to capture their imagination. We don't really try to engage with people in a way that works. And so I think it really is important for us to find ways to engage with the broader imagination. And in linguistics, there's a lot of ways to do that because linguistics covers so many different domains, covers so many different interdisciplinary ideas. And space is one of them. I mean, space is interesting to literally everyone. Yeah. As we established earlier.
Once again, full circle.
And,
yes. It's what I live for.
Yeah. So, I mean, as Andrew pointed out earlier, we're a young field. We're a field that also has, I think, a lot still to prove. Like we're a field where it's not uncommon for an engineer to say, oh, I can just do your field with a computer program that I made in 30 minutes in my garage, which is not true.
Yeah. Nope.
But
they believe it.
They believe it. And part of the reason is because we don't go out and articulate what we do well enough. And so I think opportunities like this, where we can talk to the scientific community and hopefully also get some traction in the popular community, are really great opportunities for us to show who we are and show what we do. And I really think that's important.
To get into sort of why is it important to talk about or to get the public aware of linguistics, not just as a field, but just to get people more in touch with language. I mean, language is probably the most important aspect of our lives that differentiates us from the other animalistic aspects of our lives. And it permeates almost everything we do. And even aspects of our lives that don't really require language, we add language to them anyways. And so we can't really help it. It's just, it's like birds fly and humans language, right? And at the same time, we know very little about language as a phenomenon. In linguistics, we know quite a bit, right? But I tell my students after an intro course, just one semester, that they know more about how language works than statistically 100% of the humans who've ever lived. And that's, I feel like this ignorance, if you permit the word, ignorance about how language works really negatively shapes how people interact with language. Because language is actually really cool. It's an amazing set of systems that interact with each other in ridiculously complicated ways. Our linguistic knowledge is probably the most complicated knowledge any of us has. And we figure it out before we even go to school, right? I like to tell people that a child can master its vowels before it masters its bowels.
I love it.
But and it's almost ridiculous that even happens, right? Because you would think the digestive system is a bit more crucial, but we've evolved to be otherwise, right? So these language systems are really interesting when you compare them to each other, when you see how they change over time, when you see how they're used in different domains of life. And but the way that people interact with language now, especially through this kind of education and this prescriptive, let's say bullshit, when it comes to how language is thought to work, it makes people scared of language. It makes people feel bad about language and feel bad about themselves linguistically. And they, the fact is they shouldn't. The things that they know how to do as language speakers are really impressive and they're really intricate. And, people should feel better about that because, not just because feeling better is better, but it's more realistic. So if we can be more realistic and, healthier, then, we should be doing that. And outreach is how we start to do that. Right? And outreach, as Jeff points out, outreach helps people understand what our mission is. But I find that with linguistics, because people know so little about language, it really helps people understand themselves better, and that helps in a lot of ways, and I think that will help inspire people to really get into linguistics as well.
Yeah, and if you can just walk away from someone and like the only thing they learn is my language is not bad, I mean, I feel like that's a huge victory.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of sad that that's like such a low bar. Your language is not bad.
Right. And you're not bad for using it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right?
I mean, how many people have you come across who, when you tell that you're a linguist, they're like, oh, you don't want to hear me speak. My language is bad.
About 50% of the people that I meet, if I tell them that I'm a linguist. Yeah. It's really it's upsetting.
Exactly. And if I told them how much I'm listening to how they talk, they'd think I was a creep.
Yep.
Yeah.
But you can't help it. You can't turn it off. Once you have the analytical tools, you're like, ooh.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, that was an interesting use of it. Yeah. Even like the other day, this was on the internet, and someone was like, so the verb gaslight, when you gaslight someone, right? What is the past tense of that?
For me, it's gaslit.
Gaslighted.
Jeff?
I put ED on everything.
I put gaslighted. I like gaslighted better. Yeah. It sounds weird to say like, oh yeah, my boss gaslit me for a week. That's kind of weird.
See, it sounds totally fine for me. Yeah,
and I'm all in favor of more strong verbs and English inflection. But yeah, just for me, I like gaslighted better. But I feel like that's, it's an area where there's variation, right? So
yeah, I have some really strange past tense verbs though, like knit. Mm-hmm. In the past tense is knit for me and not knitted.
Okay.
So very cool. Well, thank you guys so much for coming on and talking about this. This was so fun.
It was a lot of fun. I had no idea what the fuck was going to happen or what I was getting into.
Well, if you were more of a nerd, this would have been clear.
Yeah. Also, they gave you two papers to read.
I did read them. I still didn't know what I was getting into.
Oh, okay.
I mean, to be fair, when we started this, we didn't either. It was just like, let's check it. Yeah, let's think about it. And then the more we thought about it, the more issues came up. And and we've who knows what we've even left out. I'd like to get some more linguistic feedback.
Definitely. I mean, it opens up even more questions when you even figure out something, if you can say it's figuring out something. So language. That's how it do.
That's right.
Well, we leave our listeners with a final message. Don't be an asshole.
Don't be an asshole. The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by me, Carrie Gillen, for Halftone Audio. Theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at VocalFriesPod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com, and our website is vocalfriespod.com.